Bienvenidos y bienvenidas al MS2 Club.
There are development companies that leave their mark in the people that play their games, and today we have the great pleasure to have in the MS-DOS Club one of the founders of one of these companies. Thanks to him, we got lost in the dungeons of Eye of the Beholder and Knights of Lore. We fought wars in distant worlds to control the spies and the Tiberium, and we felt citizens of a cyberpunk world in Blade Runner. For all of this, we had to greet our guest, Luis Castle. Hello, Luis.
Hi there. Nice to meet you both. And hello to all your viewers.
Well, we are going this as a podcast. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, all your listeners.
we have the cameras because it's easier for you to be looking at.
No problem at all. Okay, then I won't worry about trying to stare up in the sky. That's great.
Okay. Well, first of all, we want to know, how did you enter in contact with computers?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. Brevity is not my virtue. I started in high school. I wanted to become an architect, and I went to a conference in Las Vegas and saw that computers were being used to draft designs from architects. And so I had always imagined that if I couldn't make it as an architect, I could always be a draftsman. And so I realized at that point, maybe very optimistically, that computers would replace draftsmen very quickly. So I better learn something about computers. And I'd always played games. I played pinball machines and arcades. Who didn't? Every kid did, I suppose. So I liked them, but it wasn't something I imagined doing as a job. When I got my first computer, I worked as a busboy in a hotel to earn the money to buy my first computer. When I bought my first computer, I got a job at the computer store. And then I just discovered that I really liked working with computers. I did some artwork for some games. I met some people that made games. I met Brett. We worked on a couple of games together before Westwood. And so that's kind of how I got into games. I started as an artist, though. That was what I was doing, is animation and art. And back then, the way you did art was you would draw on graph paper. You would draw what you wanted to do, and then you would actually bubble in the graph dots and then convert them into hexadecimal and type them in, because there were no mice, there were no drawing tools. And so one of the very first things I programmed was some drawing tools. so I wouldn't have to do that as much anymore.
Okay, sorry, but what was your first computer then?
An Apple II. Yeah.
An Apple II, okay.
An Apple II, then I got an Apple IIe, then an Apple IIe Plus, and from there I kept buying Apple computers, but by the time we started working on games, we were working on Z80s, Ataris, Commodores, and Apples. Mostly Z80 or 6502 chips in the early days. So. And I did program in assembly language. Almost every game maker back then learned assembly language, even though I was putting in games for magazines where you would actually write them, you would type them in for BASIC. That's how you actually, as an independent game developer, that's how you published your games. You would send the source code to a magazine, they would publish it, and the consumer would type in the source code. And so they paid you a fixed rate based on the number of pages your game was and such. So it was like a couple $100 or something like that. My first game was in 1982. It was called Squirm. So.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's the main difference from there in the States and here in Europe, that we didn't have really Apple IIs. That was.
No, you had Sinclairs and you had some other ones. Yeah, I did do some games on the Sinclair as well. Over the years, Westwood, in the early days before Westwood even, I was trying to do a game a month, and that was ambitious. But most game developers back then, if you were making simple games, you could get a game done in a few months, 2 or 3 months. They were usually very simple. They were Hangman. They were, kind of a take on Space Invaders, or my Squirm was a kind of a multiplayer surround Snake. If you played this game Snake, it's very similar to Snake. It just had a couple little tweaks to it, but it was basically a Snake game.
Yeah, no, at that time, only one person was all you needed to know for one game. Not like today that you need a huge...
Yeah, no, that's true. I was probably very late to still build games all by myself for the most part. I think the last game that I built almost on my own was called Dragon Strike. It was a dragon flight simulator, shipped in 1989. I wrote the math libraries, the 3D projection systems. I did all the animations for the dragons. I say almost on my own. A programmer named Ethan did most of the UI work because it's just time consuming. And then my very good friend who's passed away, but was one of the great artists for Westwood, is Rick Parks, did almost all of the drawings of the full screen pictures. I did actually do 3 or 4 of them myself, but he did most of them. So other than that, though, the game was pretty much all my own. Even the writing, which I'm not the best writer, but I guess it was good enough to where it got into.
It's awesome. Dragon Strike is not a little game. It's a huge game.
It was a pretty big game. Yeah, the map of the game was 65,000 meters by 65,000 meters, all fractally generated, because back then the entire game fit in a little over a megabyte, and so there was no way you could store a map of anything like that size. So I think that was the thing that most people marveled about on Dragon Strike, was that you could fly over this terrain. If you had a powerful PC too, you could actually turn up the fractals and it would generate more or less curved surfaces everywhere. So pretty fun. It used to have textures in it, but I had to take the texturing out because it was just too slow. So. Just normal vector shading. So
you were ahead of the times then.
Well, I was I had the what's the right word for it? The convenience or the blessing to be able to be a founder of my own studio, so I could do what I wanted. I wanted to make a flight simulator, so we found somebody willing to fund it, and we went and made one. It's like, I don't know if it was probably the best economic bet to make. It did okay. It was an okay game. It didn't make a ton of money, but it did okay.
Okay. Well, how it was that you opened a company that produce computer games named Westwood? In Las Vegas.
Well, okay, so yeah, there's a couple of questions in there. Let me unpack that. First, the way we started the company was Brett and I started working on some games. We worked on ports mostly. So we did Dragon's Fire to the Apple. I think that one we did for the Atari as well. I think I did artwork on that one, and maybe some graphics code for shifting on the fly, which was moving characters around on the Apple. And then it was either that one or the next one, Impossible Mission, which was a Chaswell's game. We ported it to the Apple. He had written it on the Commodore. That was quite a challenge because he basically really, really pushed the Commodore 64 right to its limits. And so trying to get that to work on the Apple was very challenging. It was a difficult problem. Brett did most of the coding on that one. I did most of the artwork on that. And then let's see, we did a couple maybe other ones, and we worked with ACT, and we did some casino stuff for the local casinos. And ultimately, we were just getting to be really good friends. And we had a conversation, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I just like to have fun. I love what I do. I love having a job I like to do. And he goes, well, I think I want to build a company, and I want to build something that can really stand on its own. We're making all these games by ourselves. The guys who do the business side of this, basically they get a deal, they get it signed, and then we do everything else. Why don't we just do our own deals? I said, sounds okay to me. So that's how Westwood was born. And we originally called ourselves, I think, Brelos or something, and just discovered that was a terrible name. And we incorporated under Sperry Castle, also not the greatest name for, probably would have been okay to be Sperry Castle Associates. That would have been all right. But I really liked California. I liked Westwood, California. That's where people in Vegas used to go to hang out. So we decided to call ourselves Westwood Associates because if we couldn't do games full time, it was a professional enough sounding name to where we could do professional software for, which is what I did at the time as a side job. So I didn't have to have a job to pay my bills. I basically did professional programming for point of sale systems and accounting systems, integrating accounting systems. So that's how Westwood was formed. We did our first game with Epix took a chance with us. A guy named Bob Lindsay gave us the first game, which was a port of John Freeman's games called Temple of Apshai Trilogy. I did the art. I did the programming because it was on the Macintosh, and Brett did the game design and managed all the business side of it. So we started a company. So he was taking care of the books and, basically going through the licensing and all that stuff. So it was just the two of us. We started off in March of 1985, and it was successful. We got the game done early. They moved the date in by a month. We were supposed to be done in November. They said, "Oh no, we need to ship it in November. It needs to be done in October." So they told us that in like August. So there wasn't a lot of time. So we worked our butts off and got it done sooner. It was really, really pretty solid. A pretty much bug-free game. It was one of our best, I think, in that way. And they liked it so much, they said, "We'd like to have you do the Amiga and the ST versions." The Amiga hadn't really even come out yet, not at least not full force. So we got a dev kit that was like a box with wire wrap in it, and I went in to start working on the Amiga because it's 68,000 code, and that was now my bailiwick after the Mac. So hired our first employee with Barry Green, got our first office in January of 1986. And Westwood was born. And from that place forward, we just kept moving forward, sempre avante.
Okay.
Yeah, and also you got some IPs, no? Some external IPs like for Disney or Nightmare on Elm Street, Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, we did a bunch of IP work. So the first games we did were for Epics. Like I said, they were ports. But we were pretty quickly known as a place that could do really great artwork on 16-bit computers. We employed artists. So most games companies back then were programmers that had an interest in art or something like that. But what I did very early on, one of our very first employees, I think might have been employee number 3 or 4, I had a friend named Maureen Starkey. Actually, Brett and she was both of our friend, and she was a bit older than us, and she was very established as a comic book artist. And with me doing a bunch of programming in low-end systems, I rewrote the operating system for the Amiga to build our Amiga games because the Intuition operating system had some poor documentation at the time, and I couldn't figure it out in time. So I basically just rewrote the OS and ran a light version of the OS for the Amiga and emulated the Atari GEMS system. So that's a long story, but because I was doing all of that and I wrote Super Cycle in that same year, I just didn't have time to do a lot of the artwork. So one of our first hires was an artist. That's what she did. She didn't really know how to use computers at all. We taught her how to use computers, gave her some tools, and she did a great job. And she's still in the industry. I think she did an amazing career. And so from the very beginning, Westwood was known for great art. We had these 16-bit computers back then. That was fabulous artwork. Now everybody looks back and goes, 8-bit art. It's like, well, that was actually 16-bit art. It wasn't 8-bit art. we did some pretty nice stuff. That's how we got that IP. So, when we got into doing some original games for EA with the Mars Saga, and we were always looking for work. And I don't remember who it was who reached out to us originally with, might have been Roger Hector, who reached out to us from Disney and said, "Hey, we want to make these 3 kids games, Donald's Alphabet Chase and Mickey's, let's see, Goofy's Railway Express, Donald's Alphabet Chase, and Mickey's Runaway Zoo. And we want to do these games. We have these concepts, but we want to make them across all these different platforms, Apple, Commodore, high-end systems, everything." So we were one of the very few places that could just put it across all the platforms. So we actually built those games. Those were more or less designed by us as well. So they had a concept, but we actually had to go through a game design process and everything. Disney Interactive was very heavily involved in that, so I don't want to take away from any designers who might be listening who contributed, but for the most part, we had to actually build the game designs and the product itself. Same thing with Dungeons and Dragons. We worked for SSI for doing strategy games, and they got the Dungeons and Dragons license. Largely due to the work that Westwood did, because they were up against EA for the license, and EA went in with a bunch of salespeople and presentations about what a great publisher they were, and they were truly the best in the industry at the time. Them and Mediagenic and a couple others were certainly tops. SSI was not really in that same tier, but we at Westwood we created a dungeon crawler tech for them, so they could do a demo where it actually had a kind of a Eye of the Beholder, precursor to Eye of the Beholder actually, but that kind of technology in character graphics. I was always into 3D and such, and so I wrote all those systems and tools, and that's actually how we landed that one. So I'm going to leave you off there, but basically, if you want to go back to any one of our licensed properties, it almost always started with Westwood having a reputation of doing things a little bit a more high-end, higher quality, and pushing the envelope. And we were able to land a lot of really significant deals going forward, things like Lion King and Blade Runner and a lot of others.
Did you take any inspiration in previous games for the Eye of the Beholder, for example?
Eye of the Beholder was a very specific one. So I'm sure people might remember a game called Dungeon Master on the Atari ST. It was a brilliant game, but I mean, they would. I don't know if they played any of our games, but prior to Dungeon Master, we had done the 3D systems for the Gold Box games and all the things. So the Dungeon Master was. Even itself drew a lot of inspiration from Wizardry. What was one of our great inspiration games. The trick for Eye of the Beholder was to take the rather complicated D&D system at the time, and it was not designed to be digitized at all. It was very much a role-playing game, and to convert those rules into something that would work on a computer was quite difficult. That was myself and Phil Goro's job, really, for that game. Maybe Phil was on Eye of the Beholder, or on Eye of the Beholder too, but early on we worked together on it. Brett, of course, had things to do with that. So did Joe Bostic. So a bunch of us got together and kind of ground away on it until we could figure out how to get reasonable representations of most of the D&D rules, and some of them we still couldn't do because there was too much human judgment that had to be used. And so we managed to pitch the deal for doing a 3D game, a crawler for Eye of the Beholder. It was a pretty big budget at the time. I think. It might have been $100,000 or something like that. Who knows? No, actually, now that I think about it, no, it was close to $1 million. It was 900,000. So because I remember we got to the end of the budget of Eye of the Beholder 1, we ran out of money, and Brett and I ponied up the money to finish the game because we wanted to spend another month or so, and it was another $100,000 to finish it. So that was not really a wise business decision because we were on a very small percentage of the revenue as a developer. So our dollars cost us 5 or 6 to 1 from a publisher. So it was not a wise thing to do from a financial point of view, but it made the game a hit, I think, at the end of the day. And so ultimately it was probably a good decision, but nobody would have thought that at the time. It seemed like a conceit more than a decision, more than a business decision. So.
Yeah, no, I think many people remember that game fondly today.
Yeah, and really, honestly, Eye of the Beholder owes so much to Rick Parks as well, because Rick was just a master of making these 16-bit computers look like they had much higher resolution than they really did. And he was just genius with the pixels. He was just such a great artist. So, and then we had a lot of other very famous and talented people on our staff. So I don't want to take away from any of them, but I think all of them were inspired by how what a wonderful human being Rick was, and how good he was at just making things, making some beautiful stuff like Kyrandia. We've had the same pixels anybody else did, but if you looked at Kyrandia, it was head and shoulders above any other game at the time visually.
Yes. Well, how it was to work for SSI, and how it was for SSI working to TSR, the people that have the rights of Dungeons and Dragons.
So it's difficult to say how their relationship was, because we really didn't. I wasn't in that side of things. But working with SSI was always great. Westwood was really fortunate to partner with SSI early in our growth. Because we were in Las Vegas, we had to recruit from other places. Oftentimes, we just couldn't bring people from California to live in Vegas. They just didn't want to live in Vegas. So we had to find other industries. EG&G was an engineering group, so we got a lot of civil and mechanical engineers to become games programmers. We had one of our UPS drivers did flip books, and he did an amazing job with them, so we trained him how to be an artist for our games. So, I mean, one of our best programmers was a former manager of a Taco Bell, he was a hobbyist programmer. So Westwood was really scrappy. We didn't pay high salaries, but because we brought people in that didn't really have careers in gaming, and we taught them. The people there were myself, Brett, and many others were really just interested in bringing talent to bear, basically helping to grow people, mentor them. I certainly don't want to take away from the talent that people had, because they were all talented people. We would have never hired them, but at the same time, they weren't known in the industry, and they couldn't have landed a job in the games industry unless they had worked for us first. The reason this rolls into SSI is that in the beginning, of course, we were just doing the work for whoever would hire us, and pretty soon we got a pretty good reputation. And SSI would come to us. Chuck Krogel, who's one of the founders of Petroglyph, he came to us and said, like, I still want to keep working with you guys, but we can't pay the kind of rates that other people are paying, because we started getting some pretty big contracts, Disney and EA and such. And we said, well, that's cool. As long as you're okay with us bringing newer people on the project, we promise you we'll oversee it. And if something goes wrong, we'll fix it. But we want to work with new talent and development. So if you don't mind us growing our teams with your projects, we'll do stuff like Road Warrior Europa and Ultima 2 and a bunch of other ones. No, that's not right. Not Ultima. It'll come to me, but Ultima, of course, was Garriott's game. But we would start to do these. We'd start to do these other games that were good games. There's nothing wrong with them. Mostly strategy games, honestly, and that led to Command and Conquer eventually. But they weren't games that you would normally pay a top price for because there was a relatively small market. And that's how we grew the relationship with SSI. That was before they had the D&D license. So we helped them. We had a great relationship with them. We worked on the D&D license together. And then, of course, their whole studio was dedicated to building D&D games. So they wanted to build all the premium SKUs or the premium titles for D&D games, which we totally understood. They didn't want to outsource that stuff. But that little original demo that we did, the game, the engine, the dungeon crawler, and the tools that went with it, they used those for all the Gold Box games. So Westwood got a small royalty on everything that SSI did in the D&D license for many, many years. And it was wonderful for us because it was a significant amount of money for our overall budgets, and it basically allowed us to work on original titles because it was basically just a royalty stream that we didn't have to keep supporting. So really happy with our relationship with SSI. There wouldn't have been a Westwood without them, and we owe them a huge debt for believing in us when others didn't.
Okay, it's fine. But did you know if the TSR have?
Sorry, I missed the question. I didn't answer the question. Well, the reason they got the deal was that TSR recognized. We worked with Jim Ward quite a bit, who was at TSR Hobbies on the Eye of the Beholder and later. We did a game called Hillsfar very early on, which was almost like a WarioWare of collection of D&D small games like lock picking and things like that. And Hillsfar was our first foray working directly with them. That was before Dragon Strike and others, and it went really well. And then once they had some success with the Gold Box games and they were making a lot of money, then they actually could afford Westwood. And that's actually how Eye of the Beholder came to be, because they were finally able to compete with some of the other publishers for pricing. And we said we'd love to do a game like similar to Wizardry or some of the other games we'd done in the past, the Gold Box games, but with much higher quality graphics, similar to what Dungeon Master did. But we're going to do that on the Amiga and on the PC, and do something that's very, very true to the game, to the D&D rules. And so that's when we started working directly with TSR. They were not difficult to work with, as I recall. A lot of people said they were, but I was such a nerd. I was a D&D dungeon master for 16 years, and so I had done all my own campaigns. I'd written my own modules. I never really published them. I gave them to friends, and I thought I would publish them one day, but the game was too busy making a games company, so I never got around to it. But anyways, our relationship with TSR was really pretty seamless because honestly, I don't think that they could have found any developer anywhere that cared as much about D&D as we did and wanted to, as faithfully as possible, recreate the experience of a Dungeons and Dragons session. And so I think that in many ways, like when I wrote a lot of the story that went into Dragon Strike, I had read all of the Tracy Whitman, the Dragonlance series. The names are, I'm going to mispronounce their names, but with Raceland and all the other characters. And so basically, I just loved the series. I read all the books. I did the modules. I mean, I was just into it deep. So when I went to write the story and stuff for Dragon Strike, I was like, well, the War of the Lance had all these great battles that were referenced back in the books and in the things that kind of like side notes. Well, in this area, they did this. In the Pelennor Fields, they did this or whatever. So I went back and said, okay, let me go write the story of the War of the Lance. So I referenced all those books. I came to them with all their canon and said, here's all the references. Here's the people that were important. Here's the dragons that were involved. And so I don't think that they had a lot to do other than just to kind of nod appreciatively and say, well, you guys really do know our license pretty well. So I guess it's good. And they were very, very pleasant to work with. I didn't have any trouble with TSR. I've heard people complain, but we had no problems with them.
And then, well, there were 3 Eye of the Beholder games, no? But
there were, yeah. We didn't do the third one. Yeah, no, we did the first one, obviously, and it was a huge success, and we had to come out of pocket to finish it, as I described. And the second one, we got a much bigger budget, but once again, we ran out of money. Once again, we came out of pocket to finish that one as well. And we really wanted an extra disc on the first one. We had a whole ending animation, but it wouldn't fit, so we had to just do a text ending instead, unfortunately. So that was the only disappointment. On the second one, we got the extra disc, so we had more space. And we had started work on what we would be doing for the next game. We owned all of our tools, but of course we don't own any of the IP for D&D or the worlds and all that. And that was right around the time that Virgin acquired Westwood. So we couldn't. We did talk to Virgin about doing about SSI about doing Eye of the Beholder 3, even though we were our own publisher at that point. But they said no, we're going to take over that title and do it ourselves because obviously, our relationship with you has to end, and so it might as well be now. So we didn't end up doing Eye of the Beholder 3. That was done by the folks at SSI. Instead, we took that same kind of construct. We changed the things we wanted to change. We actually rewrote the game rules because we felt like there was some really room to make game rules a little bit better for real-time games, and created Lands of Lore. So Lands of Lore became the spiritual successor to Eye of the Beholder, but it didn't use any of the IP, obviously, of D&D, and we didn't even use the same RPG system. That was the one that Phil and I Phil mostly did that one, but with a lot of feedback from myself because I had a lot of passion for RPG systems back then. I had done the Hollow World games as well for SSI/TSR. So I was really into RPGs, systems, gaming systems as a former DM. And then that of course, Lands of Lore became its own franchise. That was a big hit franchise. We did multiple Lands of Lores over the years as well.
You may not believe it, but we have some people in our Telegram group of the podcast listeners that have been playing to Lands of Lore these past few weeks.
Excellent. I love it. I love good old games. I'm always finding. There you go. Right on. Excellent. Scotia. The evil witch. Yes. Scotia was an interviewer at the time. I heard later that she was actually pleased that we made her the evil witch and the villain of Lands of Lore. She was a very very harsh critic of games at the time, so it was an inside joke for the industry. But no, I'm glad you guys are playing it. I think Lands of Lore was brilliant. Some of the things that Rick did where, he really blew up the people's faces. So there was like just the portraits were partial faces and stuff. And there's just some decisions that we made that made the game just look so much better. We really wanted to get this idea of cinematic systems rolling right into the game. So Lands of Lore 2 used voxels. It was probably either right on time, right with, or right, maybe even right before we did Blade Runner, which used all the voxel technology for 3D characters. And then really, honestly, we were trying to work on the low-end systems, so we didn't want to depend on 3D acceleration. That's why we really didn't invest in the 3D systems like a lot of other folks did. So we went with all bitmap graphics and rasterized graphics. Fun stuff, though. I'm glad you guys liked Lands of Lore. I thought the world was wonderful.
I think it's still today. It's a great game.
Oh yeah, it's a great game. Lands of Lore 1. Lands of Lore 1 is a phenomenal game.
It's excellent.
Yeah. Lands of Lore 2, Lands of Lore 3 didn't age as well. And then I think we might have done a 4. Copper was 4. I don't know. It might have been 3 or 4, but they didn't age as well because the rasterized graphics. It's still pretty amazing though, even in Lands of Lore 2, if you're going through the world and the little pixie characters are flying around and doing special effects and all this. And back then, that was just like unheard of. Like nobody was doing that. It's kind of like Blade Runner. People ask me how many polygons were in Blade Runner. I'm like, well, 1 million, because every pixel was effectively a polygon. Every single pixel of every screen had a lighting information as well as depth information and color information. So, we were able to do real-time lighting effects across the entire screen, which simulated basically an infinitely dense world. That was the goal, anyways. Of course, the resolution in the video players makes it kind of crunchy looking sometimes, but pretty amazing technology for back in the day. And if we had done that today, if we were to do the same technology today, you'd have a 4K screen that every pixel was a polygon effectively. So it's actually weirdly. In a very different way, accomplishing what the virtualized geometry does for Unreal 5. So same idea, which is decimate the scene down to individual elements. So it's sorry if I'm going off into the weeds, but I'm a former engineer, so I love the technology.
Yeah, no problem. We love technology as well. So all technology, especially.
It's always fun, especially when it translates to great looking pixels.
Yeah.
One little question before talking about Virgin. Did SSI borrow the engine of Age of the Beholder for the third Age of the Beholder and Dungeon Master? Do you know?
not Dungeon Master. Dungeon Master was Faster Than Light, totally different.
Dungeon Master, Dungeon Hack. Sorry.
Oh, so I don't know. They did use the Eye of the Beholder engine because although we owned our engine, they had rights to use it for sequels. So they did use, at least they've referenced it. They might have rewritten all of that stuff though, because I know their guy Anderson, I think was his name, last name was Anderson, Steve Anderson maybe. I know he was very keen to writing a much bigger world. And so we had a different approach, and it always goes back to, many decisions in games are almost religious debates. They're not really, there's no right answer. So at Westwood, we preferred smaller, denser spaces and experiences. Even when we went to do games like Renegade and others, we didn't really want to do open world games. We had done some early games like a Mars Saga that had these massive planetary spaces and such. And over time, we just decided that we wanted density and to pack in as much entertainment in small space that people could get their heads around. So that's one decision. It's a creative decision. It's not a technical decision. It's just how you do it. The other one is to go to something that's completely different. Massive, massive spaces that have just a lot to explore, and it's a lot of adventure to them and all that. But then by definition, they can't quite have the same density, or if they do, it can't be quite as rich and diverse as you can, because you just got more space to fill. And so Eye of the Beholder 3 really went with very, very big maps with lots of stuff in them. And I think personally it wasn't Westwood style. So the franchise, it deviated from the franchise as far as the style of the game. And I think that's why it didn't have quite as much of a good reception, because people were expecting a different kind of experience. But in and of itself, it was a good experience. It wasn't that it was a bad game at all. And I think that happens again and again. I'm playing Starfield right now, and I really like the Bethesda games. People have criticized as No Man's Skyrim, and I'm like, sure. But I like that. It's fun. I have a good time with that. And there'll be a very different experience that somebody else might do that doesn't try to create that vastness and expanse. And I think that's oftentimes fans will align on one or the other like a religion and say this is better than that. And I just don't think that there is a better. I think it just comes down to what's your particular tastes.
Well, the fact is that last month I played Lands of Lore for the first time, because in Spain there was a pack that makes Lands of Lore unplayable in a 4x6.
Oh,
it was impossible to play the Spanish version of the game in a 4x6. So I had the game in the day, but I couldn't play it. So I have played it last month, and I can say that it's the way to go after Age of the Beholder 2. I had played Age of the Beholder 1, 2, and 3, and sorry, but I prefer.
Yeah, 3 wasn't. 3 was not really it was a different kind of game, and this is the problem with sequels. If you change too much in a sequel, then the audience, even if it's a great game, they don't respond well to it, because they're playing your franchise for a reason. It's also why it's extremely difficult to make sequels, and people don't understand that as consumers. They're always saying, well, I want a game just like the one I played. It's like, no, you don't. You want to feel the same way you did when you played that game, but you don't want us to change anything, and then you're going to complain that it's all the same. And it's exactly what goes on. So, my hat's off to people like the Treyarch team that kind of kept reinvented Call of Duty, and of course the original team as well, or Madden football. To make American football, gridiron football, exciting every year is just an extremely difficult thing to do, because you can't change too much or people won't be happy. But if you don't change enough, they're just going to say, well, it's the same old, and then they get disenfranchised. So, having successes, and it happened with Command and Conquer. It certainly happened with almost every game. It's a challenge to make another one that, or even expansion packs sometimes that really make people happy. It's a very, very big challenge. It's a different kind of challenge than original IP. But I'm glad you liked Lands of Lore. It was our chance to be inspired by the work we'd already done and create our own world, our own systems. Now that you've played them, I'm sure you realize that the RPGs, the actual nuts and bolts of the RPG system are completely different. Actually, they're presented very similarly, but the actual mechanics are very different.
Yes. Well, in the early 90s, there is a company named Virgin Interactive. And what happened with Westwood and your company? and Virgin? Sorry.
Virgin? Well, Virgin acquired us. So when we started with Virgin, we were doing, what was the first game we did? It might have been Dune. Yeah, it might have been, it can't be Dune because we already knew each other then. We had started with Kyrandia. We had signed Kyrandia with them. And we were working with Dune, but there had to be something else we did with them before, and I'm just not. Oh, it might have been like Friday the 13th or something like that. We did some other games with them, anyways, and we kind of got to know them. And we were working on Dune II, which was supposed to be called Dune. It was supposed to be just called Dune, and the Kyrandia games. And we went around to other publishers because we were trying to place Kyrandia. Actually, I think Dune was already signed with Virgin because they had the license. And Kyrandia was an interesting game at the time. It was an adventure game, but it was a point-and-click adventure game, and its innovation was the entire screen was essentially the game. Most games, adventure games at the time, used to have like a noun and or verb and noun, like get, box, place, object, whatever. And we wanted to do something that was more context sensitive, so that you move the cursor around, the cursor would change, and you could just click on things. And of course, it was really to celebrate Rick Park's art, because he did such the whole art team, but especially Rick, beautiful artwork. So we could actually fill the entire screen with artwork and do this stuff. And it was quite innovative at the time. So we were around shopping him, and our agent at the time, Barry Freeman, knew the guys at Sierra Online. So we went to Ken and Roberta's over there in Corscold, and we showed the game. And I think they felt, if nothing else, a little threatened, because it was that was their bailiwick. They owned the adventure space, and we had some innovations. I think that they were surprised that we got them to work right. In fact, I know that's the case because they told us as much. And when we went back, we said we felt really good. We had just knocked out of the park. They're going to sign this deal. We're going to get a great game. And they wrote back and they said, well, we like the game a lot. But we don't want to publish it. And we're kind of like, sad panda. We're like sad trombone. And they go, we want to buy your company. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. That's unusual. And prior to that, because Barry is Barry, he had talked to Martin Alper, and they had gotten Richard Branson to call his company. So about a week before that, I'm sitting in my office and I get a call, and the pleasant lady goes, hello, I have Richard Branson on the phone for you. And I'm like, oh, okay. Right. He goes, hello, Brett. And I go, no, this is Lewis. He goes, oh, Lewis, my name is Richard. I'd like to buy your company. And I said, oh, I'm snarky. I said, oh, I didn't know we were for sale. And he goes, my boy, in my experience, everything is for sale. My colleague, Martin, will be calling you later, but I just wanted to say that we're hoping that you become part of the Virgin Things. That was about the conversation. I mean, maybe there was another sentence or two, but not many. And I walked away, and I didn't know who he was. So I walked to Brett, and I said, Brett, I had this weird call. This guy just said he wants to buy our company. And we had to look him up to figure out who Richard Branson was, because there was no Google or internet back then. Then, of course, we're come back from Corscold, and we get this call from Things. So all of a sudden, there was a bidding war for the company that we didn't even know we were selling, because both Virgin and Sierra Online wanted to buy our company. Ultimately, Virgin didn't offer us anywhere near as much money, about a third as much money for the company as Sierra would. But Sierra Online wanted to put a COO in place and a manager in place, and have myself and Brett just be creatives. And we talked about it a lot, and we said, we're 29 people. We're doing pretty well, make a few $1,000,000 a year. It's not like things. We don't pay ourselves anything. I mean, Brett and I made like $30,000-$40,000 a year. We took almost no salary. But we were like, I think we're pretty good at this. We're pretty good at this business stuff. I think we can actually make a go of it, right? And I don't know the way I would just want to just be a game director anymore and have somebody else with the purse strings. I kind of like being in control. And so ultimately, Sierra wasn't willing to take the gamble that we could grow the company from 29 to more. And they said, well, that's a deal breaker for us. We need to put our own management in. And Virgin was quite the opposite. Virgin was like, that's great. We're happy to make you there, but you're gonna get paid a lot less, and you'll be paid if it's successful. Paid a lot more if it's successful. And so ultimately, Virgin gave us a better deal. And people ask me a lot, why would you sell your company for, really it was only a couple $1 million, which the company made more than that. So it was like kind of silly. And the reason was because the deal we had with Virgin was as long as we were successful at meeting our budgets and our forecasts, we would have at least that money guaranteed for the next year. So we were essentially given a guarantee not to ever have to go backwards or do layoffs or do any of that. And Brett and I were willing to take the gamble that we could do that we could meet our forecasts, that we meet our projections. And that was 1992. And so right after that, we shipped Dune II, which was supposed to be Virgin thought it might be a 10,000, 20,000 unit seller. We sold 60,000 units, and I think it was pirated millions of times over the years. And then we had games like Kyrandia that did very, very well, very successful game, adventure game. We had Lands of Lore, also a success. And then we rolled right into doing Lion King, Blade Runner, or actually Lion King, Monopoly, Command and Conquer. The hits just kept coming. So it turned out to be a very good decision for myself and Brett, but once again, it wasn't a very wise decision from a guaranteed return. We could have been personally much more wealthy if we had just sold it to Sierra Online. So that's how we got to know Virgin. I'll say this about Virgin, which is really important. Because we were so successful at getting products done, and because we were financially motivated to do good jobs and get things done quickly and get them done to quality, we were shipping most of the titles that Virgin was shipping in those early days. They had other teams working on stuff, but it was much more longer term stuff that was going to take, like Toonstruck, and they had some stuff with Seventh Guest and other guys that the Trilobite. Those games took a lot longer. Clive Barker's Books of Blood never even shipped. So in the meantime, we're making all these games. Well, Virgin had created this great empire, this publishing empire, and they were really good. They were really good in Europe, but they were also good in the United States. It was a great team. And if it wasn't for them, there wouldn't be a Westwood, because they were the ones who were out there basically promoting and publishing our products and building our brand. And we were very fortunate because this entire mechanism that was built for all these games, we were making most of the games. So we had a disproportionate amount of attention and spend on our games. So I'll always remember that and always be thankful to Tim Chaney and to the team at Virgin, Daniel Woodard, and so many others. They just did a great job. Louis Beatty, Christian Glue. I mean, without these people, Martin Space, without them, Westwood would never even have existed, because they basically made our games hits, worldwide hits.
Okay. Well, we had some questions about the Dune II.
Yeah. The name.
Dune 2.
It's a weird one, right? Yeah. So it's supposed to be called Dune. So my conceits were, I was a D&D fan, as I already mentioned, so I got to do Dragon Strike and a bunch of other D&D games. I was a huge fan of Blade Runner. That comes a little bit later. Brett's favorite book was Dune, his series. It really was. So Martin said, hey, we have this licensed Dune, and the guys in Europe it looks like they're not going to end up finishing this game. Would you guys want to make a game? And we said, sure, we'll make a game. And then he talked to Bostic, and we were talking about favorite games back then, Military Madness and Rescue Raiders and a couple others. And they ultimately designed what would become known as real-time strategy for Dune 2. And I did most of the art direction on that one because we wanted it. Ren Olsen was the head artist, and we wanted it to feel very dry. He was a pastel artist, so the look and feel of the game was meant to be like, sort of the same way they have Native Americans in the North, or Native Americans all over the world or Native people around the world have so many names for snow because there's so many different types of snow. Similarly with sand, we wanted the world to feel sandy and have all this different kind of very dryness to it. Anyways, long story short, Brett was super excited to do Dune, and we were very close to finishing the game. And lo and behold, we go to a publishing meeting, and they didn't cancel the game in Europe, and it was almost ready to ship. And we were supposed to ship around the same heels. I think we were only a few months apart. They were very close together, yes. And there was no time to get another name approved, and so we basically became Dune and Dune 2. And this was kind of a reflection of the fact that nobody expected a strategy game to do very well, because strategy games were 1,000-unit sellers. 10,000-unit sellers would have been a hit. To sell 60,000 copies was just extraordinary at the time. And so weirdly, I think in the annals of history, the original Dune is not as well known as Dune 2 because it's the beginning of a genre. And the only reason it was called Dune 2 is because we just didn't have time to come up with a different name. It was called Dune 2 Battle for Arrakis, but they said that was too obscure, so they didn't want to call it that. And then ultimately, when we put it on the Genesis, I think, the Mega Drive, we called it Dune 2 Battle for Arrakis, the appropriate name. So, but that's why it had a weird name. I think
in Europe it was called Battle for Arrakis, no?
It might have been, yeah, because we wanted to call it that. And
I think in Europe it came with that name.
Yeah. In the United States, they thought it was too obscure and too inside baseball. They said, the number of people that will play a strategy game and also read the Dune books is going to be too small to have it. It's too confusing. So that's the problem when you don't own your own, you don't have your own publishing. You're kind of a victim there. And then once we had one of the first renegotiations with Virgin, we got a chance to have our own publishing group inside of Westwood, at least our own marketing person with Laura Miele. She was our first marketing hire. She now runs Electronic Arts, but she was in the architectural business, and she was doing a great job marketing her firm that she worked with. And Brett had found her somewhere, I don't know where, but we were very, very fortunate to have Laura run our marketing department for all those years.
Well, the fact is that Dune II was the first or the origin of the RTS genre.
Yes.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Who had the idea for the game?
It was three people. From a story point of view, I think Edie Larimore was probably the one who refined the story the most. It was Brett's vision at the end of the day, just like Command and Conquer. And then you had Joe Bostic, who was the one who was really passionate about the design. So if you wanted to give the most credit, I would say Joe and Brett have kind of equal credit for creating the first RTS game. Joe was playing a game called Military Madness on the NES TurboGrafx, which we also did games for. There were not very many game systems we didn't make games for at Westwood, but he liked that game a lot, and Brett really loved Rescue Raiders, and the idea of real time was something that Westwood was really adamant about. Even from the very first game we did, Temple of Abshai Trilogy, we actually made that game in real time, and Epix was horrified, and they were like, no, you can't change the game, you can't make it real time, it has to be turn-based. So I had to go back into the code and make it turn-based. And so that's why all these games, you'll see it coming up again and again and again. Even some of the strategy games we did for SSI, we tried to put real-time elements in. We always felt that it was really exciting to have to make really complicated decisions in a very fast time frame. That to us was made for great fun, right? And so that's really where real-time strategy came from, was, hey, we want to make this game that's similar to these other games where you have resource management, base building, you have to attack the enemy, but at the same time, you have to defend your base, and all of these different elements coming in all at once. You had fog of war, you had to do scouting. I mean, there's just, if I had explained that to somebody back in the day, they would say, oh, there's no way. Nobody's going to be able to manage all of that. And now you watch people playing StarCraft 2 and they're like, 300, 500, 600 actions per minute. It's like ridiculous, So clearly human beings are much more capable than anybody really gives them credit for. So.
Well, there is one difference, no? Because in Dune, you could only give orders to one unit at a time.
Yeah, well, that was our first one. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's the pay. No, that's the price you pay for being the first.
Well, we didn't. I mean, the idea of dragging and selecting objects. There were so many things that we just thought that just felt like they were just too abstract for people at the time, and we had a big debate about that. And it's like, well, people know how to use Windows and Macs to drag select a bunch of files on a desktop. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. But I can tell you that in early tests, people just didn't get it. I mean, it was really hard. So it took a while for basically Dune II, then Warcraft essentially copied us. I mean, they were effectively the same game but a new theme. And they did a good job of copying it and doing it really well. They executed it very well, but the mechanics weren't terribly different. They weren't much better when it comes to collecting. It was actually Command and Conquer that had the drag select and started doing the group selection and all that. And that's actually where we start getting into the more nuanced evolution. And then we had cinematics, but we filmed our cinematics. They did all CG. They ended up doing some phenomenal CG. Blizzard's the best at that stuff. I mean, they're so good. So over time, it was great going between Westwood, Blizzard for a while. Then Microsoft threw in with Age of Empires, and there was a good three-way thing going there to try to keep one-upping each other. It was good times.
And competition is good for the final customer, no? Let's say.
Oh yeah, it was great to have competition because everybody was trying.
You have to go ahead of the.
Yeah, nobody could rest on their laurels. You had to be trying to do something new and better. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
there were thousands. There were so many real-time strategy games. Everybody thought they were easy to make. I can tell you.
But some of them were really crap.
Most of them were terrible. Yeah, the vast majority of them. There were a few that were really interesting and belong in the history too, like Supreme Commander, and there's I think the guys that did the Homeworld games were always good. Alex Gardner, those guys did a great job. In fact, actually, what's their World War II one is The second version of that one was one of the best games ever made, best RTSs ever made. I can't think of Company of Heroes, maybe. That was a phenomenal game. So yeah, there were some good ones for sure, but the vast majority of them were terrible. And to this day, it's part of the reason that real-time strategy games are challenging to make, because to make a really good one, you need the kind of investment that Blizzard had made into the StarCraft 2, and that kind of investment doesn't have a real obvious return on that money. You would have to count on being the number one game to be able to say it was worth it, and that's tough to invest in.
Okay. After Dune 2, you did 2 another games about Dune, but you started to do games named Command and Conquer that changed the spice for the Tiberium. What happened?
Well, obviously we like the mechanic of mining. So we had talked about, even before Warcraft shipped, so before that, we had talked about like resource mining, where you would have a mining rig and things like that, oil drilling, because Dune, the original Dune book has a lot of, the Dune series has a lot of parallels to the oil, the discovery of oil in the desert and such. If you get into that, you can go read lots of research on that. Whether Herbert was really motivated by that, or whether it just could, conveniently lined up, I don't know, but certainly it had that. Ultimately, we wanted something that would be harvestable, because that was a core mechanic that worked so well in Dune. And we didn't want to do spice again. Obviously, that's too much on the nose. So we had started off with a strategy game. The strategy game was called Swords and Sorcery, and it was about they had mana lines that would go through the world, and you would actually have to find these nexus points and mine the mana out of it with magical rigs. And then the non-mana people, the swords part of the sorcery was mining gold. Gold, iron, and things like that. It was actually minerals. And so we had started that off, and you had the fairy folk that were the kind of enemies, which was goblins, orcs, etc., and the humans were the other side. So humans versus orcs, way before Warcraft. Thankfully, that isn't what we went with, because it would have been a head-to-head competition with Blizzard's ideas. But ultimately, we were working on all that, and Brett was adamant that we had started working on the video sequencing stuff, where we could film things and produce video for the CD-ROMs, because CD-ROM had just come out. And it was like we didn't know how we would ever get, Brett, Rick and all the artists, how we could ever do enough animation to fill 700 megabytes. It just would have been an astronomical amount of hand animated stuff. So we wanted to do filming. And when we did filming, Brett's like, we need something that's a little bit more relatable, because I don't know how we're going to film all this stuff to fill up this CD. So he wanted to move it to military, make it near future military instead. It's something that everybody can relate to, and it's much more part of the zeitgeist. And this is way before, of course, 9/11. And the idea that he had was, the principal idea was that there was this charismatic leader that would fight against the established governments of the world as a terrorist organization that had no real nation, and such. The Brotherhood of Nod was born. And so, kind of hauntingly similar to what happens with Saddam Hussein, not Saddam Hussein, but Osama bin Laden later. And so basically, that was the Command and Conquer through line. And then he came to myself and the technology team and said, well, we have to play full screen audio and video, so it looks like you're actually watching it on the news channels at the time, CBS, NBC. I don't think even CNN existed at the time, maybe just. And it wasn't possible. Basically, there were no video players that could even play full screen audio and video from a single speed CD-ROM. There's only a 144 kilohertz data stream. It's very, very small. So I said to Brett, it's just not possible. We've done the research. And he goes, well, you're just being lazy. Figure it out. So myself and Chris Yates and some PhDs from, I think, the University of Washington all got our heads together, and we started with the stuff they did, the vector quantization stuff, but then I kept having to tune it to use some of my compression algorithms that I had used in the past. And we had written like speed loaders for the Commodore 64. I don't know if you guys remember that kind of stuff, but to make games load faster, we would actually compress the data on the disk and send it across in a compressed format, uncompress it on the computer. There's some weird things that you had to do back in the day. So I was really into compression, and so we ultimately got the thing working. We got it working. It was like, okay, we can do full screen audio and video, but you just don't change a lot of the screen at once because it counts on the previous screen. And so the first thing the artists do is give us a screen full of static. I'm like, okay, so change every pixel on the screen, every frame, right? So I would write like an algorithm would analyze and go, okay, that's static, so I'll just replace that with random noise. And then I said, okay, that worked fine. So we got past that thing. Then it was like, oh, we're gonna do a couple of animations. It was working really good. And then all of a sudden they did a fade to black. And I'm like, oh my God, you're changing every pixel every single time. So I'd have to analyze it and figure out that it was a fade. And I said, okay, well, if you're going to fade, you guys use a 3-second fade. We're going to use 3 seconds fades. And of course they changed it to a 10-second fade or a 2-second fade. I'm like, this was this constant back and forth. But ultimately the compression algorithm that drove Command and Conquer that allowed for that story and the near future stuff all came out of wanting to make it more accessible to people and wanting to create this experience of a full screen audio visual that felt like a video feed at that day and time somewhere else in the world. It also got the notice of the U.S. government because they were working on something similar, and they said, "Where did you learn about this?" And I was like, "Didn't learn about it. We just made it up."
Okay.
But there was one thing that was lost, and I think it was one key mechanic in Dune. It was the worms.
The worms, yeah. Well, you didn't have worms.
You were always to be on the lookout for them when you were harvesting.
When you were harvesting, yeah. And we talked about, all of the features obviously got done that way. So, but there was, ultimately, eventually in Tiberium, the Tiberium becomes poisonous as well, but it's a different kind of effect for sure. Creates the I can't remember the name of the groups now, but creates the mutants.
Okay. Well, we are going to cut some questions, so we are not going to talk about Blade Runner.
We are going to talk about okay.
This is a curious question. One of our Patreons say to us that Dynamic, a Spanish company, had the intention of developing a game based in Blade Runner. Mm-hmm. Did you know of this or any other game based on the film before your own game?
No, when we went to pitch Blade Runner, I had mentioned that Virgin came to us with the Dune license. It was a very similar story with Blade Runner. We were just having a quarterly meeting with Martin Alper, and he goes, we got some franchises you might want to look at because we were, big at building franchise games back then. And we had done Lion King. We had signed Lion King and done Lion King in '94. Yeah. So he said, we got this thing Blade Runner, but it's an old film, like Blade Runner, the film Blade Runner, Ridley Scott. And he goes, yeah. He goes, you know it? I go, yeah, I know it. It's like my favorite film. I love this film, And he goes, well, this has been around a while. They've been shopping it around a bit. He goes, we probably could put a bid on it for us. So he called up the company, Lad Company, and they said, well, we're kind of close to finishing deals with a bunch of other companies, but if you want to pitch us, I guess we can have you come up here before we sign anything else. We'll give you a chance to show it off. And so they didn't really think we would have anything particular strong. And myself and the team and Aaron Powell and everything just got together, and for the next I think we had about 2 or 3 weeks to prepare. We basically, Aaron and the graphics team recreated the first opening scene of Blade Runner in CG with 3D Studio Max. And I came up with the harebrained scheme of having a game that had essentially almost an infinite number of endings, which ended up being about 47, which is still a lot. But it's a simulation, it's a story simulation versus we had done this game called Circuit's Edge. Anyways, long story short, we went in there, we pitched them on the game, and we popped in the beta SP tape and played this and everything, and they watched the sequence and all that. And they're watching it and they're kind of looking at it curiously. And they, as soon as the thing stopped with the fly through, the scroll, and the bombs, it goes Blade Runner, Westwood Studios, and they go, where did that come from? It didn't look like the film. And we said, no, it's not the film. We recreated it from scratch. And they're like, they puzzled for a second. They go, well, what are you going to use from the film? What footage? And I go, none of it. We're not going to use a single line of film or a single frame. We're going to recreate the entire world in CG, and we're going to animate it in real time. And you're going to be able to walk through the world, and it'll be at the same quality level as the film. It'll look like you're playing a movie. And the story is going to be about a parallel story that happens along with Blade Runner that is in the same city, where you'll see hints, you'll talk to the same characters, you'll see hints of what's happening. And so your story is interwoven with the film. We don't change anything that happened in the film. And instead, we focus on making that experience a unique experience for every player. So we walked out of there feeling pretty good. Apparently, they got on the phone almost immediately afterward. Later learned from Josh, and they basically called and shut down every other conversation and said, these guys get it. They know what the film is about. They know what the story is about. And so I didn't know of anybody else, but later in my career, I would have people from EA come to me and go, what the hell did you do? We had that deal done. What did you guys promise them? And the irony of it was we really didn't economically, we didn't do anything particularly, incentivizing or anything like that. It was just that I think that they just believed so strongly that we understood and cared as much about the property as they did.
Okay. Well, the fact is that the atmosphere of the game was spectacular, and in modest pieces of the time, it looks fine. It looks great. What was your biggest challenge for the game?
Oh, wow. There were so many. I guess my biggest challenge, if I had to just summarize it, it would be that because I love the property so much and because I wanted I wanted so many innovations, and I kind of broke one of my own rules and one that I try to live by today. Almost everything about Blade Runner was an innovation. There was very few things that were, the fact that it was a point and click game was pretty much, so context sensitive mouse and all that. That was not innovative, but almost everything else was new. Like it just hadn't been done. And I think the biggest challenge was balancing treating a property like Blade Runner with respect. And getting it to be authentic while having all these innovations was the biggest challenge, is balancing those two things. And for the visual style of the game, we were failing miserably, to be honest, in the early days. We had we hired Sid Mead, who was the original concept artist for the film, and he was creating these wonderful new worlds. And the stuff that we copied from the film, where we recreated the environments, looked great, looked very similar. All the new stuff just didn't feel right. Didn't look like Blade Runner. It just felt like something else. And we couldn't figure it out. And I remember Donnie Miele, who was now married to Laura. They ended up getting married and having family and all that. But Donnie was the lead senior producer. And he and I were talking about that just didn't look right. And of course, I'm the kind of de facto art director for the whole suite. We really didn't have art directors at Westwood. So each team had an art director. Aaron was more or less the one for Blade Runner. But I'm looking at this, I'm like, it just doesn't feel right. So we ended up hiring the production manager. And this was Joe Kukin, who played Kane, his idea, which was hiring the production manager from the film. And they told us, we said, how did you guys interpret the stuff Sid Mead? Because if you look at the Sid Mead drawing and you look at what they put in the film, it just doesn't look the same. He goes, well, we had to film on set, so we had to find a location that was similar. And then we had to go dress it up. And, we didn't have like vacuum presses and all these other stuff that they have today. So we would just go to the props room and grab whatever junk looked okay. We would spray paint it and stick it on the wall and throw some neon up there and grab an old sign from an old Indiana Jones film and stick it up there or whatever and just cobble it all together. And that's how we built the sets. And like, oh, right. That's why it looks so different. So I went back to all the artists and said, you have all these big libraries of shapes and everything. You have to use the stuff from the library. So you're not allowed to model anything. Go try to make it look like Sid's work, but you can't create anything new. And, there was much complaining and whining about how hard it was going to be, but it produced the look. Ultimately, it created that layered look of worn and kind of cobbled together and everything being repurposed that ended up creating the Blade Runner universe. And so that was a big challenge, was just getting the look to look the same. And then I can go through the details of the technology too. It started with static screens from environment to environment, like Kyrandia, basically. I just didn't sell it, right? Because Blade Runner not raining has just felt weird. It was always raining in Blade Runner, So it was like, okay, well, we need to animate the environments. And so I had done all this compression work for Command & Conquer. So I said, okay, well, let's just use animated environments instead of static environments. So got that working. But then it still didn't look right, because the minute you animate it like a giant fan or something going on in the background, the Z buffer had to animate too, so that objects could clip in and out properly. So we had to animate that. So I had to create a new compression algorithm that was specifically designed to optimize Z buffers. So that worked okay, and we got it animating and everything else. And then the next step was, okay, but the lighting doesn't look right. The characters, we tried sprites, they looked terrible because they couldn't take any of the lighting, and they just felt completely out of place in these rich 3D environments. So Bill Petro and myself worked on. He was principally the coder for it, but my crazy idea of doing voxels. So he figured out how to do slice models, which was an optimization of voxels. So we created characters with voxels. So then finally the characters looked like they belonged in the space and they could collect lighting. So then they still didn't look right because you couldn't walk around the scene without picking up the light. So we had to create normal vectors. So we had a normal vector path or channel that would do all the normal vectors. So we take all the lighting. So it still didn't look right because there was all these clouds of smoke and volumetrics. So we had to create a volumetric system that would dynamically generate all the volumetrics for mist, smoke, and lighting and beams of light and things like that. And finally, it's like, okay, it actually looks right. And that was months and months and months of work, which back in those days was a lot of your time. So we finally got it to where I feel like, it felt like it really looked good, and by that time we were almost out of time. So all the compression for the characters kind of suffered. So a lot of characters were really blocky when they didn't have to be, but with 2,800 motion capture sequences, we didn't have time to hand touch up all the sequences. So many of the background characters are quite chunky and blocky. So I could go on and on. Very late in the day, we learned how to move the camera. We learned that we could move the camera. I don't remember who suggested, it wasn't me, but somebody had said, how come we don't just move the camera from scene to scene? And I'm like, well, you can't do that because it has to be on a loop. And I'm like, wait a second, actually, we've got like 3-second or 4-second loops, and the camera would, if it moved fast enough, it probably could do it. And so we tried it, and it was like that was like the moment where your eyes just kind of bopped out of your head because you're looking at this world, it looks static, and you're kind of figuring out how it's going to work. Every now and then a spinner would fly through the scene, and you're like, how the hell did that work? And how did everything light up? And then suddenly the character would go back into a hallway or a corridor or an alley, and the camera would follow them in the alley, and you're like, okay, everything I thought was working on this thing, I have no idea how you guys are doing this. And that was basically that layering of the mysteries, the layering of the tricks, but it's all simple tricks. So, or maybe not so simple, but all tricks. So. Okay. Sorry to ramble on. There's an awful lot to share.
It's really interesting. So yeah, continuing then with the questions we have. Then what happened then between Westwood and EA?
We weren't owned anymore. Brett and I sold the company in its entirety to Virgin in 1992. A portion was then sold to Hasbro. Then all of it was sold to, including Virgin, was sold to Viacom, who put it under Spelling. Viacom then wanted to dispose of the assets because video game costs were very, very high. And they were going to shut it all down, and they realized that Westwood was a very profitable piece of the Virgin Empire. And so they started looking for selling Virgin and Westwood. Nobody wanted both. Ultimately, they told us, well, we're not going to be able to sell the whole company. So we're just going to sell Westwood. And we really didn't have a choice. I mean, people always come back to me and say, well, what can you say? You don't own the company. They own the company. So, we basically had Microsoft, Hasbro, and EA in a three-way bidding war for Westwood in sort of early 1998, I think about February, March. And then by September, EA and Microsoft were the last ones at the gate, and we ended up selling to Electronic Arts. So we became part of Electronic Arts. They gave us the keys to the kingdom. They said, do whatever you want. They were very, very generous and gracious. And the only thing they didn't want us to do was a lot of the secondary titles we were working on, like the kind of, like we had the group down in Irvine doing like a Golden Nugget, Thrill Kill, the games that were not going to necessarily be AAA games, but they were going to be very solid business games. EA didn't want any of that. They said, look, we just don't have time for that. You have to just do hits, to do only big stuff. And I think that's really what hurt us, was we tried to go from being a studio that had a portfolio of games where we had a range of our talent to just trying to do every single one of them, trying to be massive hits. And Brett and I were very ambitious. We wanted to do an MMO. We wanted to do, first-person shooter, third-person shooter. We wanted to do, so we just started all these big projects, and ultimately just couldn't get them. We got them done, but we couldn't get them. We couldn't stay at that same high-quality bar that we had done on so many other games. And so ultimately, that coupled with wanting to have everything in one place, a destination studio, we ultimately didn't end up doing that in Vegas. It was in LA, so we closed Vegas and moved everybody to LA to become part of EA Games. So that's a very short summary of a very long period of time. But I don't ever want to paint EA as the villain here. They weren't the villain. It was a combination of maybe giving us a little too much rope to hang ourselves with, and if taking personal responsibility. I mean, I was very ambitious about all the projects we were doing. We were probably just trying to take on too much. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Coming then to the present, what are your actual projects or your current projects, and are you in the gaming industry or?
Yes, I am. So Westwood was 2004. We closed Vegas. I then went on to EA, where I was the chief creative officer for EA LA, and I was there until 2009. And during my time there, I spent 3 years working with Steven Spielberg on the games that he was working on with EA. We shipped Boombox and Boombox Bash Party, which were the highest rated Wii games in EA's history for at least several years after that even. And they're still I'm very proud of those games. They inspired games like Angry Birds. So, very, very fun games to build. Then went on to IAC and I ran their games division. We had some games that almost made it. They didn't quite make out the door before IAC got out of the games business. I then went to Zynga, worked on a couple of games at Zynga. Then was in the gaming, the gambling industry for a little while, the casino gaming industry, while I was still contracting with games companies to work on a couple other titles that some shipped, some didn't, but quite a few. Then after that, I went to work for mobile games companies. I worked with Kabam, with Gazillion, was PC Mobile, and then Funny or Die, Kixeye, did a strategy game at Kixeye. It was called Rogue Commander, War Commander Rogue Assault, and that's a mobile version of kind of RTS, real-time RTS, mobile RTS game. So I've been doing games ever since, I suppose, is the answer. And most recently, I went to Amazon for 4 years, shipped games at Amazon, racing games and third-person shooters, and then went on to do some sports games for a company called Green Park. And now I'm at Deviation Games as the president. And Deviation is a studio founded by a lot of the folks who worked on Call of Duty. In fact, Dave Anthony is the founder, basically. And he worked on 5 Call of Duty games. The ones that people will remember are like the big ones: Black Ops 2, Zombies, and he's just done 3 games that have all done over $3 billion each. So he's a very accomplished game maker himself. So my job is to take care of most of the nuts and bolts, so he can focus on being the game director for the game they're working on. We haven't announced the game, so I can't give you many details on it. But the folks here are some of the greatest talent that I've ever had the chance to work with in my career. So I'm pretty bullish on the stuff that we'll be able to create together. So that's a very quick way of summarizing, I don't know, another decade and a half or so of career.
20 years of work, yes.
Yeah.
So, Luis, the last question, and we free you. What should we have asked you, but we haven't?
Let's see. Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never been asked that one. That's a great question. What did you miss?
Maybe we didn't miss anything.
Yeah, no, you got a lot of it. I mean, there's always a million details on all of these things. I guess the thing that people have asked maybe in the past that I think is interesting is, people ask how, if I'm coming into the games industry, how would I have a career like yours? How would I do that? And I don't think, not because I'm particularly special, but I don't think it's possible anymore to have exactly the kind of career I've had. And the reason I say that is the reason I've had the opportunity and the blessing to be able to do things like on operations, a tech person, the low-level programming designer, business leader, all these things is because the games industry was so small when I started and it's grown so much. And now to build projects that we build today, it would be almost unthinkable to try to do all the different things I've done to the kind of level that I did them at the time. It's just be impossible to find somebody that could be that great at all those things. So my best advice is to follow the things that excite you and interest you, and don't take anybody's restrictions as your own. Don't argue for your limitations, because I feel like so many times people in this industry, especially early in career, they feel like they have to specialize in something, and that might be your bag. That might be what you do. There's some of the best people they just do one thing, but I would say if you're a programmer and you want to do art, do some art, see how it comes out, right? If you want to do audio, do it. I think it's the wonderful place about games is because it's science, business, art, in technology, all these things are mixed together. It's a wonderful place to just find exactly the kinds of things you like to do that you can be great at. And I really do believe that most people would be at least professionally competent, if not excellent, at the things they love to do. And so I still find it's a wonderful industry, and I have an infinite amount of energy to put time into it because I really enjoy it. And Dave Anthony, my boss, the CEO here, he says all the time, it's all he's ever done and it's all he ever wants to do. And I can say that, games are maybe not all I've ever done, but it's certainly the thing that I love doing the most. And as long as that's the case, then you've got what a great life you have if you're doing something you love to do. Very, very fortunate. Thank you to all the listeners out there. Anybody who's playing games I made decades ago, thanks for that. I appreciate that. It makes me feel great.
Well, it has been a pleasure to have you here, Luis. Thank another time.
Absolutely.
And I think that the people that is listening to you is going to learn a lot about Westwood and the industry of video games.
Absolutely. And if you ever have any detailed questions, you can always, how to reach me. Shoot them away. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Goodbye, Luis.
Bye-bye.
Bye.